Right, intangible assets. This is a bit of a shorter topic. One, because you had the assessment last week, it backs off what we did last week in quite a significant way. So we will see a lot of crossover from what we did last week. We will be talking about just other general things because I think there's a lot of interest in a lot of things that we can talk about with intangible assets. But first, before we get there, the mid-semester exam. The date has been released. You should all be aware of it. It is the 26th of September on the Friday. It isn't a Saturday exam, which I suppose we can all be thankful for. So it's 9 o'clock in the morning. It is, yes, it is the last day in the exam block. So whether that's good or that's bad, I don't know. You can't really change it, so it is what it is. Should turn that on. Okay, so a couple of things, and maybe given that we've got more people working here, I mean, most of you should have the ability, especially during exam week, to get time off. But worst comes to worst, scheduling, if you do have problems with that date, and that's not just for us, with dates for other exams, to apply for scheduling difficulties, or whatever the term is, that's by the 5th of September. So you need to put in the forms for that and say, look, I have a problem with this date. Simply saying, I know the holiday week is starting after that and I want to jump a day early isn't going to count. But if you do have something that is on that you've got to go to, then talk to them. Special conditions, if you have to apply for special conditions and haven't yet done so, that's by the 29th of August, so just be aware of that. This exam, if you miss it, you don't get a resit. It is going to be just a reweight of the final. So that'll turn the final into an 80% exam, which is pretty brutal. So I wouldn't, you know, like obviously if you're sick and you can't make it, you can't make it. But if anything happens and you're wondering what the best course of action is, just contact me. Just send me an email, you've got my numbers, just get in touch with me and I can advise you what I think the best course of action is. And it's happened again this semester, or related to last semester. I've got people after the results have come out, and even after this semester started, coming up and saying, this happened to me last semester, and you go, I can't do anything about it now. If you tell me back then, I can at least sort of give you a guidance as to what best to do. If you tell us after the results are out, there's very little that can be done. So just let us know. You don't even have to detail too much what it is. Like if you want to keep sort of a level of privacy there, just say something's going on, and I can just say who best to talk to and what best approach to take. So what it covers, we've talked a little bit about this before, but it's topics 1 to 6. So it's not, there are 8 topics before the break. So the final 2 topics are not in the mid-semester exam. So it's topics 1 to 6 in the mid-semester exam. The 50% practical, 50% theory now make a little bit more sense. The practical stuff is actually running the numbers. So it's doing, sort of working through a construction contract and figuring out the revenues and expenses were. It's doing a revaluation and working all that sort of stuff out. That's what we mean by the practical side of things. The theory side of things is, you know, all that sort of week 1 stuff. It's here is a rule. Why do you think that is a rule? Or maybe here is a, you know, here is a situation. How do you think you should deal with that situation? So it could be, you know, Qantas receives money from passengers, when do they book the revenue? That sort of thing. So it could be an application of the standards, but in a written sense, not in a numerical sense. So the handbooks are allowed, no writing in them. There will be a number of past papers which get released over the next few. It won't be this week. It'll probably be sort of mid to late next week we'll start putting some papers out, but there'll be at least 3 to 4 past papers that come out so you can get a sense of the types of things we've asked, the way that we've asked them and so on. Yeah, we will talk more in detail about the topics as the weeks progress, but you guys at this point got any questions about the exam? Yes?
Handbook.
Handbook.
Do I really need it?
No, that's an interesting question. I actually had that question earlier on today. It's, I mean, my take on it is, you will have time. I mean, my view of it is, if you've done the work, it's more of a security blanket. It's good to have, it's handy to have there in case just mind goes blank and you're sort of sitting there going, oh, I don't know what to do. Can you do it without the book? Yeah.
I don't need to know any numbers or something.
You need to know, I mean, when we talk about the rules and how things get applied, like it's not me just sort of making stuff up. Like I'm referring to how the rule, like how the standards and how the handbook says what to do. So when it comes to sort of being in an exam, having that with you is a useful thing. So it is handy to have, so you don't have to have everything absolutely sort of burnt into your brain. But it just means that you can refer to things quite quickly. So you don't need it. We're not forcing you to have it in there with you, but I think it is a useful thing to have. But that's just my view of it.
So there's no need to quote it or say Article 8, Section 5.
Look, I think it's certainly going to, if you see two responses, I mean, there's 300 and something of you guys here. I mean, if you see two responses to a similar question and one has, you know, referred to it and referred to proper paragraphs and all the rest of it, yeah, they're going to, it's not to say if you don't refer to it, you won't pass that particular section and get sort of reasonable marks. But the one, you know, if you refer to things properly and support your argument and all the rest of it, that's going to do better. So that, I mean, I think that answers your question. Yeah, I think that was a Danielle.
Tags on your text?
Yeah.
But they not have writing?
Yep.
Except like tags.
Yeah. So you can highlight stuff, you can underline stuff, you can star stuff. You can't, just no writing like on anything that comes into that exam. But yeah, you can put tabs in. Cool.
And one more.
One more.
With the theory question, does it have to have some standard like academic English essays or something?
No, they're generally short answer. We will talk more a little bit about these as we come to them. I mean, we prefer not to see sort of bullet pointed. It depends on the question. You'll see example questions when past papers get released. We prefer to see written answers, not kind of just bullet pointed answers. But again, we understand it's in an exam, not in, you know, not something that you're preparing at home. So the standard of the quality of the writing for what you handed in on Monday, we expect to be obviously much better than what we're expecting in an exam. Like, we still want to be able to read it, but yeah, there's sort of a lower bar to that extent. Yeah.
We don't have to memorize our assignment for it, or is it irrelevant?
Nah, not at all.
Cool.
You shouldn't have to memorize it now. It should be just sort of, should just be part of you. 10 years from time, you'll go, I remember when I had to offer advice on Fujitsu. Maybe. Anyway. So yeah, actually, and one last thing on the assignment, thank you for those, and pretty much everyone did get it in on time. Thank you for those that did. If you've got any questions about your submission, or you haven't yet submitted, or something has gone on, we're going to have time at the end of today. Come and just have a chat to me and we can have a talk about it. On with the show. So, the big picture. I included this here. I mean, it is a useful thing, as I said right at the beginning of the semester, just to think about how this all fits together. Now, information, that's what accounting is basically providing. We talk about incentives, we talk about regulation. The thing I want to just focus on today, because it is relevant for intangible assets, is information. And the reason why I think it's relevant here is, from a preparer's point of view, and you guys may not necessarily know what you want to go into. I mean, you already may have sort of career paths mapped out. You maybe have been swayed by Khalil and decided to go off and do honours. I don't know. But from a preparer side of things, to obviously prepare financial statements, you need to know what the rules are. Like, that's, I would say, a pretty important thing. From an analyst point of view, or for someone looking on the investment side of things, knowing what is included in the financials, but also what is not included in the financials is important. Because when we come to intangible assets, there are a lot of things which are important and investors do find important, and actually are important for the business, full stop, which don't get included in the financial statements. So what we're going to be looking at today is what gets included from an intangible side of things, and also what gets excluded, and also why, because the why becomes important there. The neat thing about the framework is a lot of today is actually very similar to what we did last week around property, plant and equipment. Like, it's actually very similar. So in a sense, I'm going to focus more on the differences and where things diverge from what we saw last week. I will go over a little bit what we did, because it is important. You know, it's the first time you sort of looked at it last week. It is good to just, you know, a week is a long time. We didn't have a bomb scare on Monday. What else happened? The strike. I didn't really see anything happen. I certainly didn't see anyone picketing anywhere. So I don't know what happened today with that. You guys had an assignment due, so I think mine might have been elsewhere, possibly over the weekend. You might have, maybe a few things from last week might have slipped through the cracks. So it is good that we go over it a little bit. So we're going to have a look at assets, the information they provide. Often, actually in context of intangible assets, Then we're going to go into regulation and look at intangible assets. There's no real practical work this week, so it is a bit of a shorter class. So an asset is a resource controlled by the entity as a result of past events and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity. Now, nowhere in that framework does it link to this idea of tangibility. So this idea that, a tangible asset is something physical, an intangible asset is something that isn't physical, that's not an important part of what an asset is. An asset is just something which you control, comes from a past event, and you get some sort of benefit from it. So tangibility is not an essential characteristic of that. We'll talk more about what intangible assets are in detail as we get to the standard, but this idea of identifiable non-monetary assets without physical substance. And if you think about money, I was going to say, where's my wallet? It's in my bag. Money obviously used to be, by and large, physical. It was the physical notes and coins, and that's what it was. And now money is basically digital. Most transactions don't really occur with any sort of physical cash presence. So you could argue that money is, in a way, an intangible asset, but they actually exclude money from that definition. So we're actually dealing with things outside of currency, outside of cash, outside of even sort of online type assets in relation to money. Control we've had a look at, so the fact that you have the capacity to get benefit from that asset or to deny others benefit. It's got to have already occurred, and you're going to get future economic benefits from it. When we come to recognition, and this, from my mind, this is, I suppose, much of where the problems with recognizing intangible assets become. Because I think a lot of things actually are assets. But when it comes to saying this asset can actually be recognized on the balance sheet, that's a different question. And so in terms of recognition, what you're looking at is the probability of future economic benefits, and does that particular thing have a cost or value that can be measured reliably? So again, we see those ideas of probability and reliability start to feed through. So to be able to do this, you need control, you need a past event, you need future economic benefits which are probable, and you need a cost or value which can be reliably measured. So the first thing I want to talk about, and you guys, this is an ad campaign from Tourism Australia that goes back a few years. It was about 2006 this came out. So I just want to refresh memories in case, or if you haven't seen it, just to show you, if you haven't seen it for a long time, just to refresh your memory. Does that ring bells? No. Does it make you want to come to Australia? So anyway, so the background of that is, and the reason I bring it up, that was a $180 million ad campaign by Tourism Australia. Some of you guys, I'm not going to ask for those who are doing marketing to give a spiel as to what the importance of advertising is, but in general, why do companies advertise? Or why do you think they advertise and promote?
Get customers.
To get customers. So if a country is putting an ad campaign on, what do you think they're trying to do? Yeah, attract tourists. The interesting thing was, of the money that was spent doing this, they targeted 3 markets around the world. They targeted Germany, they targeted Japan, and they targeted the UK. After that campaign, fewer people on a year-on-year basis turned up from those markets. Now, whether you can ascertain causality to that campaign, okay, that's a different thing, but it certainly didn't seem to have the effect of bringing more people from those places. In a couple of markets where they didn't show the campaign, in the US and in China, more people showed up. So, it's not to say that advertising campaigns always work. You can spend a ton of money trying to do something on a campaign and it falls flat. You can spend very, very little and it works really well. That didn't work so well. So this idea of probable benefits for an advertising campaign, because a lot of marketers say this is, you do this and this is good for the company and so on, doesn't always pan out. So that link between saying you spend this and it's going to be beneficial doesn't always hold. And so not surprisingly, advertising expenses aren't something that you can actually capitalize. You end up having to expense those out. The next thing I just want to talk about is, well, not just Coke, but is actually brand names. Because brand names are something which are pretty important. And we're going to talk at length about brand names in relation to another aspect of things. But Coke is one of the biggest brand names, most valuable brand names in the world. And certainly it is important when it comes to choice. Now this isn't Coke, although Mount Franklin is a Coke under the Coke umbrella. So I just went down to Tyke just earlier today. 600ml bottle of Mount Franklin, 600ml bottle of Mount Aqua, both bottled. Mount Aqua is of the highest premium quality Australian natural spring water, bottled at the source under strict quality control. Sourced from specially selected Australian springs, enjoy the great taste of Mount Franklin pure spring water. Whether they've just turned on the tap, I don't know. I don't know how water works. This sells for about $4. This particular bottle sells for $4 a litre. This sells for $1 a litre. I would say they're probably the same product. This one's better?
Yeah, because they've had
Yeah, but you're less environmentally conscious. They've gone this way to
I
say...
can keep it for longer. And I feel it.
Yeah, but then they start like all getting dirty and stuff, and we could just buy a proper water bottle. Anyway, yes, there is an element of truth to that. But holding aside the efficacy of getting to use the bottle later on, why do people spend 4 times the amount of money buying this than that? And you could probably argue, you know, is this one branded better? Do people are aware of it? I don't know. But people, if you look at, I don't know all the sort of studies on branding and, you know, advertising, all these sort of things. People will pay extra for things which are branded. Even though the quality, I'm pretty sure if we did this on a blind taste test, no one in this room is going to be able to pick the difference. And the quality of them aren't going to be any different either. So where it becomes problematic is, I don't doubt brand names are important. I don't think there's anyone in this room who would dispute that brand names are important. The problem is coming up with the value for those which is reliable. And that's the problem. So from defining it as an asset, absolutely, I don't think anyone would disagree that's the case. From recognizing it as an asset, there's your problem. So it sort of fails at that hurdle. Customer satisfaction. I mean, you know, how you treat your customers and deal with them. As we just saw, I know it's not necessarily, there's other issues going on with that, but you saw what happens when customers get angry about not necessarily customer service, but that bloke in the cafe down in Darlinghurst. I mean, that's not a customer service issue, but you know, he's, because of an issue about the perception of his business, he's lost customers. That is an important thing of how you're perceived. That is going to be an asset of the business. That is something which affects how successful that business is. It is not something you recognize on the balance sheet. So I suppose what the idea of all this is, if you're looking at companies, you've got to be aware there's a lot of stuff on the balance sheet which is important, and there's a ton of stuff which is not on there. And knowing what is and what isn't there is an important thing. A little bit of academic work on this. So what this study had a look at, and this is going back a little while ago, so these are looking at brand valuations which are not recognized in the financial statements. And a lot of these brand valuations aren't there, but there are companies that actually value companies' brand names and put out reports saying this is how much Coke is worth and this is how much Manchester United and Chelsea are worth. Investors do find those valuations useful. They are something which affects how investors deal with those particular companies. They're associated with advertising expenses, which, if you're doing marketing, is kind of a nice thing to know, because it's saying, you know, how much you spend on your ad spend does seem to affect your brand valuation, which is what you'd expect to see happen. Your brand operating margin, kind of the fact that you'll pay 4 times as much for this one, which is ostensibly the same product. The market share. So even though you're going to pay more for it, I'm pretty sure this one's 4 times the price. I'm pretty sure they sell more of this in the country than they do of this. And that does seem to be associated with it. They're not too sure why this is the case. You may...
Sorry.
Yes?
I think isn't Mount Franklin stocked in more places, whereas...
There's going to be elements of... But then you start getting into supplier relationships and who's put... Yeah, that's going to have an effect as well.
Coke kind of monopolises some places.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's going to have it happen. And you see it a lot with, say, the alcohol industry, where they, create, like at certain pubs, they will be a... Carlton United, they'll stock, that's what they basically stock, or they'll stock different other lines. And so that does become important, how you get stock in. And that may well be driving that as well. So, I mean, it was a throwaway yeah, a little bit of a throwaway comment, and there is obviously a lot more to it. But yeah, I mean, how you get stocked is important too. But then, will people stock you because you've got a better brand, and then where does the causality lie? I don't know. Brand valuation is not significantly related to sales growth, which they couldn't really explain why that was the case, and I can't either really, so we can leave that as something to think about. What I do want to get to is why brand name, another reason why brand names are important. If you smoke, well, first of all, you probably shouldn't, so I'll make my sort of personal view on the matter, but if you do, so be it. A couple of years ago, we ended up, the top bits of the packaging, where you see the really grot images of what smoking causes, and that was brought in by legislation to try to sort of persuade people not to smoke. More recently, they have gone to plain paper packaging, which is, if you notice right down the bottom, the old Winnie Blues, there's a very nondescript title to what they are. It is just, that is what the name of the brand is. There's no sort of logo, there's no sort of imaging around it. It's just, if you see any of the other cigarette brands, it's just going to be packaged pretty much like that. Now, not surprisingly, the cigarette industry is up in arms about this. Now, that should be a pretty good indication that brands are important, because if they weren't important, they wouldn't really care if their branding wasn't so prominent. You should just know by the fact that this is a Winnie Blue, that tells you what the quality is, and that tells you what cigarette it is, and that should be enough. Branding is important, and they fought tooth and nail to stop this coming into effect. They are still fighting. If you've seen anything in the media in the early part of this year, they've been fighting to say what has happened with plain paper packaging hasn't worked. So they've been saying it's come into effect and now more people are smoking. Now, holding aside, there's some dubiousness about the statistics, but they're saying more people are smoking. So this policy doesn't work. We should go back to proper branding. Which seems weird, because you think if more people are smoking when it's plain paper packaging, wouldn't they want that?
I think because the demand for cigarettes is just inelastic, so they smoke it.
There is an element. I mean, there's certainly there are certainly elements of, if you're a smoker, it's generally going to be quite hard. You know, my old man was a smoker, and he tried numerous times to quit. I say was a smoker, not in he's not here anymore, as in he stopped smoking. But yeah, he finally just quit, but it took him a long time to do that. I think there's actually some dubiousness around the statistics, and they were being a bit cute with what was seen as a reduction in smoking and whatnot. But the reason why they find it important, and this is where lobbying comes in, this is where vested interests come in, is we are pretty much, as a country, the test case for this sort of legislation. The UK is looking to us, because I was over in the UK when this was going on, they're actually looking at what is going on in Australia with the efficacy of this regulation to say, is it working down here? And if it works down here, we will bring in plain paper packaging up in the UK. So it's really strongly in the cigarette industry's, sort of from their viewpoint, to say this doesn't work, because if they can make that happen, then the UK won't adopt. And then it will start rolling out across the world, because they realize, hang on, this actually does prevent smoking. So, you know, brand is important. They wouldn't be fighting as hard as they are if they were just going off literally, you know what brand, you know the name of the brand, and that's enough. The rest of it is an important aspect. What I've done here, and you guys have got this on your sheets as well, is I've picked out 5, they're not at random, but I've picked out 5 companies, they're all large companies in Australia. So we've got BHP, whose market, that may all change with the demerger that's going on. Commonwealth Bank, Woolies, Fortescue and Qantas. So Commonwealth Bank is obviously a bank, Woolies, we all know what Woolies is. Fortescue is a mining company, and Qantas, we all should know what Qantas is. Market capitalisation is just basically the market value of their outstanding shares. And book value of equity is basically looking at the equity as listed in their financial statements. So if you just take the assets on the financials, less liabilities, that gives you equity. I've just gone and taken it from there. Notwithstanding, the book value of equity was probably June last year book values, but they haven't changed that much. what's something you notice when you're comparing the market cap and the book value of equity in those companies there?
There's a massive difference.
There are differences? That's okay, so that's one. So there's a difference. It's not, the market isn't going, this is what the accounting numbers are and that is how much we value the business. So there is a divergence between what the market thinks the value of the business is and what basically the accounting value of the business is. So that's one. It was,
well, usually for the market capitalization always fluctuate over a period of time, but for book value of equity, we tend to not really fluctuate.
yeah, and that's going to be the case. And obviously off this snapshot, we can't really see that, but market cap will be volatile because it's based on your share price, which is volatile. And depending on the company, it's going to be more or less volatile. But just looking at the comparisons there, what is the general sort of trend that you see in those 5 companies?
Market value is always higher.
It's not always, but market value tends to be higher. So look at BHP, 125 billion to about 78. Combank, about 136 to 45. Woolies, 46 to 9. Fortescue 15 to about 5.5, and Qantas about 2.9. Qantas is the outlier here. Qantas is actually 2.9 market cap, and his book value of equity is actually about 6 billion. So it's actually the other way around, which is a bit strange. Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think the market has a higher valuation for these companies than the accounting numbers? Are things missing? Or how do we account?
Good markets changes. Or, so you know, that's the conservatism.
Yeah, so okay. So there's an element of conservatism, we'll get back to that, but certainly, I mean, what this topic is about is intangible assets, and we know that a number of intangible assets don't get included, brand being one of them. So you generally don't see brand recognized in as an asset, so it won't actually contribute to book value of equity, whereas brand is important from the market point of view. Could explain why Qantas, so that's, you could argue Qantas is a negative brand value. There is something funny going on with Qantas. But yeah, it could be the intangibles which aren't recorded. Coming onto the conservatism type idea, think about how the 2 methods for recording property, plant and equipment sort of over time. So what are the 2 methods that we've got from 116? Revaluation and cost. Cost basically means whatever you paid for it, that's the cap to whatever that thing could be. It could be lower, but it can never be above that. So that means if you bought a piece of land, which is now increased in value, under the book value of equity, that you'll never see that jump up. But the market valuation may well reflect the fact that your assets have increased in value. So knowing the accounting rules will pick up some of why these are different. I mean, some of it is just going to be just random behavioral stuff, like people get all excited about a company and just start buying, and that affects it as well. So function influences form. Management do have incentives to manipulate. We're not going to talk about these in much detail today because we went over them a bit last week. So higher leverage likely to boost asset values. Executive remuneration. If you use return on assets, we have talked about that. We're going to see an example of this today. So that's that idea of if you spend money on something, so you credit cash, you have basically a choice. Do you debit asset or do you debit expense? You debit asset, your expenses are lower, your profit higher. If you debit expense, your profit's going to be lower and your assets are going to be lower. Now, coming on to the revaluation, and I was talking to someone about this morning. There was a time in Australia where you could upward revalue something, and if you made the revaluation upwards, you actually got that credit to gain. So you went debit asset, credit gain, and that meant you had a profit effect from it. Now, if that's the case, it's then very hard to determine whether or not, if you see a revaluation by a company, have they done that revaluation purely for the fact that this company's value is actually gone up, or are they doing it because they need that profit jump? So depending on the type of rules you've got in place, it may be hard to pick out what is the actual thing that's going on versus what does management want you to show, or what do they want to show, which is why we have regulation coming in. Which brings us to an example of a company in the US, which I dare say most of you haven't heard of, but it is a big company, and it is a useful example to have a look at. So WorldCom started in the early 80s, and by the turn of the century was quite a big company. It was a telco. Didn't last that much longer than that. And what we're interested in is why that, well, I suppose what they were doing and then why the collapse occurred. When you grow that big that quickly, you're generally not doing it organically. It's not something which just sort of suddenly just grow very, very quickly. They're acquiring companies, and they weren't doing it with cash. They were using their own shares to fund the acquisitions, which means from their point of view, they had an incentive to keep their share price going up. So that meant they had to keep their profitability going well, because you've got to keep up with market expectations of what's going to happen. So the underlying sort of thing to keep in mind is they need profit to be going well. So some of the things that they started playing around with. In 2001, they literally just went, we won't debit expense, we will just debit asset, to the tune of nearly $4 billion. So again, it's not, like obviously to make that happen isn't like, yeah, let's just rub out expenses and write in assets. Like it takes a little bit of time and effort to do that. But the actual underlying idea of what they did was simply to change something from an expense to an asset. And that's not exactly a small number that you're dealing with. Another thing they did, and we'll talk about these in more detail in week 6, is they use what's called cookie jar reserves. These are in essence saving up, when you've had a good year, saving some of that good year up, and then releasing that out into the future when things aren't going as well. So, and you're not allowed to do it. They obviously end up getting in trouble for it. And we'll talk more about them at a much more relevant point in week 6. This is, actually anyone doing ABC right at the moment? Yeah, okay, so a few. So for those that are doing ABC at the moment, those who have done ABC, what you have to do, I could get one of you guys to explain it, but what you're trying to do is when you make an acquisition, you've got how much you're paying for it, so your consideration, and then you're coming up with the fair value of the net identifiable assets. Now what they basically did was say, we're just going to make that fair value of the net identifiable assets smaller. Now that means whatever's left over is then going to be goodwill, so it's going to be intangible asset. The total assets that they bought are going to be the same, which, if they were dealt with depreciation in the same way, wouldn't actually make a difference. But they were dealt with depreciation, they got dealt with differently. So for tangible assets, if they were all counted for intangible assets, that 3.4, it'd be depreciated out over 4 years, which if you kind of run the math, is about $850 million a year. So that's a depreciation expense of what it should have been. If you get to count those as intangible assets, which is what they did, you can lower your depreciation expense to about $170 million a year. So you're saving close to $700 million a year on depreciation expenses just by misclassifying what those assets were. Again, it didn't obviously last for too long that they got away with it, but there are ways to do this, and that comes down to professional judgment on what you think just the fair value of those assets are. You get someone who's dealing with the valuations who's nice for what you're trying to do, you can make that happen. So, you know, there's some interesting things which happen with that. I'm going to step outside just ASR for the moment to talk about margin loans, because I think it is useful, because we actually see debt covenants that we've talked about in weeks 1 and week 2. We actually see some of those feature in margin loans. Some of you may trade on margin, some of you may have heard of margin lending, but I think just to get everyone on the same page, it's worth just going through an example just to see what this works. But to suffice to say, the CEO of this company borrowed close to $350 million from his company. Or more likely, they lent him that money. Now, when those sort of things happen, they're generally at fairly favorable interest rates, usually about 0. It's basically it's just free money to invest in the company, to buy stock in the company. Problem was the company didn't end up going so well. Now, this is not that company. This is the All Ordinaries Index for the last 10 years. You can obviously see what happened about 5-6 years ago. It's pretty noticeable in the middle there, that we've had a massive run up through to sort of 2007, 2008, and basically across the market, things got cut in about half over the space of 12 months. Like, people got hammered with share portfolios.
Was that the dot-com bubble?
No, that was the GFC. .com only really impacted tech stocks, and some of those got destroyed. The company that I'm going to use, so that's just the market as a whole. The company I'm just going to use as an example for a margin loan, just to run some numbers with, is actually Macquarie Group. Now, some of the investment banks, like Babcock and Brown, just don't exist anymore. Like, they just imploded. Macquarie, at its peak, hit close to $100. It was about 99 something. Within not that long, it was trading down around $15 or $20. Like, it got screwed pretty hard. Like, it's back up to about 60 now. Like, it has sort of come back up. But what I want to use that is as a basis for looking at margin lending. Go and find a pen. So imagine, and this is, you guys can do this, so it's useful if you haven't come across it before, just to be aware of what it's all about. Actually, just a quick sense, how many of you guys actually have come across margin? You don't have to be margin lending, but how many of you come across what margin lending is? So we've got a few people. The essential idea is you're borrowing money to buy shares. That's the basics of it. So imagine we have, so I'll run through this quickly and we'll, So imagine you've got $1,000 and liabilities to assets. So we could use Nick's not gone off and bought his Toyota, he's wanting to invest some money. But say you've got $1,000 and you want to buy some shares, but you want to buy actually more than $1,000 worth of shares. And you go to wherever, ComSec or one of the others, and you borrow some money. Like, you can't sort of generally get the cash, but say you've got 2,000 in cash, you've got 1,000 in liabilities, you've got 1,000 in equity. At that point, you're 50% leveraged. And let's say you buy some shares and it's $50 a share. So we've got now 2,000. So nothing changes, it's just instead of cash, we've got shares. So we're still at 50%. We invest in that, so say you bought in Macquarie shares and you bought sometime before they hit their peak, and as they go up, if I can run the numbers, they go 75 a share, so now these are worth 3,000. You still only owe $1,000. And now you've got 2,000 in equity. What's that? 100 a share. And so you've got, now your shares are worth, everyone good down there?
All good.
I don't know what happened. I don't know if I want to know what happened. I see you've had a shave too. Yeah. 4,000. Okay, so this is, say, a run up. So you bought at $50 a share, and over time those shares are going to $75 a share, $100 a share. So the assets that you've got have gone from 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000. You still only owe 1,000 on margin. We're ignoring interest at this point in time just because it makes life a little bit trickier. So your equity has gone up, and your debt ratio, so your loan to assets, has gone from sort of 50 down to 33%, down to 25%. Now, in a loan situation, they'll call these loan to valuation ratios. So your loan to the valuation of the assets that you've got, which is your loan to the valuation of the assets you've got. Now, that's very similar to what we see in an accounting sense. Like, we have your personal assets, the liabilities that you have, and the amount that you're, in this situation, that you're worth. Thing is, you can't play around with any of those numbers. Those assets are just what those shares are worth, and you can't affect that price. The liability is just what you owe whoever lent you that money. You can't affect that either. Where the margin call comes in is a lot of banks will put in a certain limit as what your loan to valuation ratio can't go above. So they may say, just like when, I think it was Danielle's and Michael, yeah, we're lending to Nick, that we don't want your loan to valuation ratio to go above a certain point in time. As it starts collapsing, we're down to 2,000, 1,000, 1,000. We're down to 25 a share, which is down to 1,000. Now the thing is, if that's Macquarie, if you bought in at 50, you're going up to 100, you've suddenly made basically $2,000 and you've done not that much for it, and you're sitting there thinking you're an absolute genius. And a lot of people were in that position. I remember watching a show on a current affair of all places talking about margin lending, and they were talking to a bloke just going, yeah, this is great, you know, just sitting there, everything's going up, awesome. He was even capitalizing the interest costs. He wasn't paying any of the interest up front, so that was just loading onto the loan. That was before 2008. You kind of wonder what happened to him. Anyway, so $25 a share. Macquarie went lower than that. But suffice to say, at that point, you're completely wiped out. Loan to valuation ratios at this point gone up to, what, 50%? At this point, it's at 100%. Your lender won't let that happen. And that's what the margin call is. As soon as you're going to breach, if this was a number that was your loan to valuation ratio, as soon as you're going to breach that, they're going to make a margin call on you. And basically, you've got to do whatever you can do to get your loan to valuation ratio below 75%. And there are two effective ways you can do that. You can tip more cash in. So if you tip more cash in and pay off some of that liability, you can get that down. So if you had 500 bucks, you could turn that into, you know, pay off some of the debt, and now you're all okay. Problem is though, if you've been borrowing on margin, the reason why you were borrowing on margin to invest is you probably didn't have the free cash to invest in the first place. So you're not going to be able to come up with that sort of money to put in. The second thing is you can do is you can start liquidating your assets to pay off that margin call. Problem is, these are collapsing. And that's the whole point. You're in a margin call situation in the first place. And if a lot of people are in that boat, people are making margin calls, people are starting to sell into a market, people are aware people are selling into a market, prices are dropping. And so you're actually going to you're not in a good position at that point. Throw into the mix that bloke had over $300 million borrowed on margin. So you're not talking like you borrowed 10 or 20 grand or 100 grand, you're talking a lot of money. Add to that, what do you think the market's going to perceive? Because that sort of stuff, when the CEO or management team starts to sell shares, they have to make that public knowledge. They have to disclose to the market that they're selling shares in the company. It's not the same as betting against your own team, but there is an argument where it's sort of similar. How do you think the market's going to react when they suddenly start to hear that the CEO is selling off huge amounts of stock in the company? Yeah, they don't like it. And that makes things worse. And so, yeah, it wasn't a good situation. Has it happened in Australia? Absolutely. Does anyone remember ABC childcare centres at all? Eddie Groves? Same deal, different amount, but he borrowed huge on margin, and then as the company share price started to drop, he was having to force to sell, and that just slid everything down even worse. So can and does happen all over the place. And at that point, we'll just take a break for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into the next part of what we're doing today. 138 is looking at intangible assets, and the really neat thing about it from your point of view, I find it neat, it's handy for me too, but it's really handy for you guys in preparing for this, is like AASB 111 and 118 were really similar. AASB 116 on property, plant and equipment and 138, what we're about to look at, are really similar. Like, So it's in a way almost easier to look at the exceptions and where things are different rather than go cover absolutely everything. But we will go over most of what's in there. But suffice to say, it doesn't take too long, especially considering we're not looking at a practical example today. So we'll be covering intangibles, and the scope in 138 covers everything except where it's covered elsewhere, like in financial assets, exploration and valuation assets, development assets for natural resources. Some of these we'll see next week, some of them we'll see in a number of weeks' time. So an identifiable asset is an identifiable non-monetary asset without physical substance, paragraph 8. Identifiability, it's getting at that idea of separability. So I mean, it's hard, well, not hard, it's easy to sell a bottle of water because you can sell it and the business keeps going on. Some things which are intangible, you cannot separate out from the business. Like, they are kind of what the business is. And you could argue for some companies, can you really sell a brand name? Just the brand name? Like, would the business still exist as it is without being that brand? I don't know. I mean, there may be examples. I'm not saying there's not, but I find it pretty hard to say, would Coke still be Coke without saying it's Coke? I don't know. Maybe something else. But it needs to be separable. For initial recognition, when it's probable that you've got future economic benefits or expected future economic benefits that are attributable to the asset and that will flow to the entity, and that the cost of the asset can be measured reliably. So again, that idea of reliability, probability and reliability. And you measure it at cost. So that really looks, if you put in property, plant and equipment, you'd probably just look at 116 and that'd be, I'd say, essentially the same thing. Now, intangibles as the standard actually sets out fall into two buckets. They've got the separate acquisition or separately acquired assets, and you've got internally generated assets. Now, we're going to look at them in turn, and we're going to focus first on separate acquisition assets, or separately acquired. Now, so the early paragraphs talk about how you can buy an intangible asset. Some of you may be aware, some of you may not, but when you see a taxi driving around, I can't just go out onto Harris Street. You know, actually, cars parked down the car park. I can't just sort of, after class, jump in my car, go out into Harris Street and start picking up people and, you know, acting as a taxi. I can't do that. Although, have any of you guys heard of Uber? Yeah, any of you guys used, have any of you guys used it? No? No, yes? Friend out. It's like the one with the, like, using a taxi or a hire car, or the Uber X? The cheap one. Is that the one where you, like, because there's one, how it initially came about is basically, I think it was like off-duty sort of taxi, actual taxis and off-duty hire cars were saying, look, we are on, like, they just map it out. If you want to hire one, you just see where they are and say, like, I need one, and they'll come pick you up, and it's cheaper. I've got the app. I've never actually used it. But what came out earlier this year was a change in that, which was Uber X, which was any one of us, if we had a car, could sign up to say we want to be a driver. And as long as we got vetted to say you're not somebody who's going to go off and sort of do things which you shouldn't drive in a car, you can basically pick up passengers. As long as, you know, someone else is on the app, says, you know, I want to get driven somewhere, it's pretty cheap, come pick me up and drive me wherever. It's not dissimilar to Airbnb, if anyone's used Airbnb for travel. So I mean, when we went around Europe last year, that's what we pretty much used for most of our accommodation was Airbnb, which is just private residences saying, you can stay here. We looked where we wanted to go and said, look, do you want us to stay here? Some people said yes, some people said no. Some of the places were good, some of them were not so good. But you don't need a license, you don't need anything to do that. It's sort of like let the market unfold. And there you go. Now, a taxi license in New South Wales costs upward of $400,000. So you can't just turn your car out and say, I'm going to start driving a taxi. You need to purchase a license to be able to do that, and those are expensive. A lot of the guys driving taxis aren't the license holders. They are just the drivers, so basically they're just staffing these cars. So that is an example of something which you can purchase. poker machine allowances, you can't just set up a, well, you can't just set up a pub anyway, but if you had a pub, you can't just say, I just want to buy the physical machine for a poker, in your pub. You need to get a license to run a machine, and those licenses are around $40,000, thereabouts. So these things cost some money. I will talk about customer lists in a moment, because that is something which is quite an interesting place, and there was an article even, when was it? A couple of days ago, which may be of interest. Costs include the purchase price and everything to get that asset to where you need to use it, just like inventory, just like property, plant, and equipment. But speaking about customer lists, they do know a lot of things. Who are they and what do they know? Well, we're about to find out. I want to tell you a story that happened in the US a few years back, not that long ago. There was a teenage girl, still at school, living at home with the parents. Anyway, they had a letter. She was shopping at Walmart, like they had a Walmart type card. Shopping at Walmart. Her parents received a letter, because it was a parents' card, sort of your rewards type card. Parents got a letter sort of, some point in time. And basically what it was congratulating them on the fact that she was pregnant. Now, she hadn't told them that she was pregnant. The way they were able to ascertain that was based on her purchasing habits, because she was using a rewards card, and you're able to link that information together and based on the likelihood of these things occurring. This isn't Walmart, this is Target, but one Target employee I spoke to provided a hypothetical example. Take a fictional Target shopper named Jenny Ward, who is 23, lives in Atlanta, and in March bought cocoa butter lotion, a purse large enough to double as a diaper bag, zinc and magnesium supplements, and a bright blue rug. That all sounds really familiar. There's, say, an 87% chance that she's pregnant and that her delivery date is sometime in late August. They are piecing this information together, and based on that are able to ascertain basically a whole range of stuff about you, which is what these things are about. I had one of these. I still actually do have one of these, and was using it for a while, then stopped using it. Still shop at Woolies, but just wasn't using the card anymore, because I got a bit like, I don't want them to know what I'm buying. And anyway, a few months after I stopped using it, I got a letter from them saying, basically, we miss you, come back. I was like, I still shop there, I just don't want you to know what I'm buying. I'll put this article up. It's an article from The Conversation from a few days ago. Coles and Woolies are looking to get into banking. They're already in insurance, they're in a whole bunch of other stuff. They're in insurance, but the thing that I found really interesting was a comment made. So I'll just read this out. So in a recording obtained by the ABC, Woolworths Director of Group Retail Services, Penny Wynne, explained how the company might use this consumer data to assess, to assess financial risk. Goodbye. Now, so this is around their insurance products. So this is a quote. Customers who drink lots of milk and eat lots of red meat are very, very, very good car insurance risks versus those who eat lots of pasta and rice, fill up their petrol at night and drink spirits. What that means is we're able to tailor an insurance offer that targets those really good insurance risk customers and give them a good deal. It's not just you're sort of providing financial information. They're linking up when you shop, when you go to the servo, not just how much you buy, but when you shop and where you shop. When you go to the bottler, and if you're buying what you're buying, how often, all the rest of it, what you're buying at the supermarket, what you're buying, how often, where it happens. If they're involved in an insurance product, if they're involved in a banking product, these things all roll together. They want to know about you.
And just one thing, I
Yeah.
was working with a company like this.
Yep.
They actually sell the information after to all the.
What's going on? I don't think so.
Sorry. They sell it to everybody, so it was profitable.
Just like-
companies for
Just like
service.
this? Yeah, and so and this is my point. And this is then, so you've jumped the gun, but yeah, no, this is where I was getting at is that stuff is obviously really, really useful for the company. What do you think Facebook and Google are about? They're not, Facebook is about knowing who you are so they can tailor advertising to you. That is their business model. Tesco, which is a UK retailer or UK supermarket, sells your shopping habits. Now, where this comes in from an intangible point of view, the shopping information and the information that Woolies holds about you, that is absolutely an asset to them. It is not a recognized asset because it is internally generated. But when they sell that information, whoever is buying it, that is what's that?
It is actually asset.
It is an asset for those. It is a purchased.
But they do it through different company.
Yeah, so it's how the, well, I suppose if they're rolling it into the same, under the same corporate umbrella, it should get consolidated out.
It's different, they have subsidy, like.
Yeah, but I suppose with the subsidiary, it still should, whether or not, anyway. So examples of such asset are customer lists. So if you purchase a customer list, you can generally recognize it, notwithstanding what's happening under the corporate umbrella. No, I think you're actually in this class. So anyway, so they're selling this stuff. But look, that's what Facebook do. That's what Google do. That's what, they know lots about us. When you're going for job interviews, they will be checking your Facebook. They will be checking your social media profiles. So it is important to keep that sort of stuff clean, or at least make a dummy one. Purchase Goodwill. So this is around ABC. So we're not really going to touch on this because there's a whole subject in relation to it. But if you paid more for a company than what its fair value of its identifiable net assets are, then you have goodwill. If you've paid less, you need to double check it. And if it's still correct, then you recognize that as profit and loss. But as I said, there's a whole subject to that, so we won't cover it too much. Internally generated. So there's goodwill, research and development, and brand names. Goodwill is easy. You just don't recognize it as an asset. It's internally generated. It's not separable. You can't sell it off. You can't really do much with it. You just don't do anything with it at all. So we can leave that by. Research and development does get split up into research and development because they get treated differently. But before we get there, I just wanted to point this out because I just thought it was really cool. It was cool and it was relevant to at least a friend of mine. This is a product or an invention which is being developed here at UTS. And I don't know, I just find it really, just something really interesting. So it's a thought-controlled wheelchair. Instead, so you don't have to have a joystick or anything, like you can just think where you want to go and it moves. I reckon that's pretty cool. So Dr. Jordan Ewan and his father, who is a professor here in the Faculty of Engineering and IT, actually created this. Now, I don't know, I reckon that is a pretty funky thing. But why I brought that up is when those guys, you can come in if you want, when these guys are doing this, and that's, if you notice, if you recognize the flooring there, that's just up in the tower, like these guys are busy sort of working on this stuff. They're not sitting there going, from AASB 138's point of view, is this research or is this development? When you've got pharmaceutical, like research scientists in pharmaceutical companies finding the cure for cancer, they're not going, should we classify this as research so we can do this with it from an accounting point of view? They're just getting on with the job. It is still important to figure out what happens with it, and that's where the accountants come in. So the research phase is this idea of obtaining new knowledge, searching for applications of research knowledge, or searching for alternatives to materials and devices. So that's actually how research is defined within the standard. In the research phase, you cannot recognize that as an asset. So if you're spending billions of dollars on research, or millions of dollars on research, that will get expensed out as it happens. Now, the idea behind that is, as that's going along, you are that early in the phase, you cannot tell whether or not you're going to find an outcome from it. Because research, by and large, is about dead ends. Like if you go off and you try to sort of search for something and it doesn't work, so you go back again and you figure out, okay, well, what didn't work there? Let's go down this track. And it doesn't work out a lot of the time. Like a lot of the money that gets spent on sort of medical drugs ends up in dead ends. So there is that probability of a benefit isn't really there. But when we come to development, you're much further along that process. You've got, just like what they have there, you've got prototypes, you've got working models. It might not be ready for market yet, but you're a lot closer to that place. And at that point, the likelihood of an economic benefit is a lot closer, but you still need to satisfy these criteria. In the future, I should probably reorder them. I think I may have just gone from the order in the standard, but if you look at the first one, the third one, and this one, so technical feasibility of completion, ability to, sort of ability to use or sell, and availability of resources. I should almost talk about just this and this one. These two are like, can you actually make the thing? So can you actually, do you have the resources and the materials and whatever you need to do to actually physically make it and have it ready for sale? Do you want to sell it? And can you actually sell it? Will it actually give rise to some sort of benefit in the future? So I suppose that's kind of linked in with the ability to use or sell. And here's where the accountants come in. Can you actually figure out what was spent during that particular phase? So the upshot of all that is you can capitalize if all of those things are in existence. With brand names, really similar to internally generated goodwill, you don't do it. You don't do it because you can't really distinguish it from the business. And in sum, that's probably not really green either. That should probably be orange because you can, but it's under really strict criteria that you can do that. Right. That we can cover over because that's just talking about the things I've already discussed, but have a look at it. Okay. This is almost identical to last week. So depreciation, revaluations, cost models are pretty much identical. So all I'm going to do, just with the interest of time and just focusing on the important things, I'm just going to point out the key things which are different. So with amortization, which is the depreciation for intangible assets, the thing which is different is which assets can you amortize. And it's those assets which have a finite life. So the opposite of finite in this case isn't infinite, it's indefinite. So if it's not like something is going to last forever, because on a philosophical level, nothing is going to be around forever. But if you don't know how long the useful life is, then you do not amortize it. So goodwill doesn't have like a cutoff period. My driver's license is for 5 years. So that payment, I'm not saying it's an intangible asset in this case, but that is a 5-year life. Patents often have a lifespan 7 years. So if something has a lifespan, then that's what you depreciate it over. If you have an indefinite useful life, then you don't have a lifespan or a useful life to do that over. This bit works the same, so as long as you're happy with last week. So we record it against P&L unless we put it against an asset. We do the depreciation just like what we're used to. When it comes to revaluations and cost model, I would say basically no intangible assets use a revaluation model. And there's a really good reason for that, which we'll get to. So the cost model is pretty much what everyone uses. The models themselves actually work just like what they did last week. So this is the same model. So with revaluation, you start with fair value, you take away accumulated amortization, you take away accumulated impairment. But if we look up the top, if fair value can be measured reliably, and they say with reference to an active market, most intangible assets do not have an active market, and because they don't have an active market, you cannot do the revaluation. And let's have a look at what an active market is. Well, fair value, the price that would be received to sell an asset in an orderly transaction between market participants. How often? Just with enough regularity. But it's this bit here. An active market is a market in which transactions for the asset or liability take place with sufficient frequency and volume to provide pricing information on an ongoing basis. You cannot have an active market for development costs. You cannot have it for development costs because development costs, it's just for your institution or just for your organization. There is not a market for these things. It's what you spent within the organization. You can't have a market for patents. Well, you can have a market for patents, but you can't have an active market for your specific patent because there is only one of them. That's the whole point. But for taxi licenses, for pokey licenses, that you can have an active market for because these exist and they're the same thing. So you can actually sell them. So potentially if a company wants to, it could do that. If it's an increment, it goes up the revaluation surplus. If it goes down to P&L. I would say be really well on top of this stuff, especially this bit. So if you're going up after having gone down, you get to go up through gain first. If you go down after going up first, you go down through revaluation surplus first. I can pretty much guarantee you that if you've got a question with any sort of revaluation in it, you're going to have a situation like that. It's going to be the case. Now we turn to impairments. Now this is the one where most intangible assets will get dealt with. So after initial recognition, an intangible asset shall be carried at its cost, less any accumulated amortization and any accumulated impairment loss. So cost, less accumulated amortization, less accumulated impairment. To determine whether it's impaired, we use 136. We go to 136, same idea as last week. Is there an indication of impairment? If there is, we go down to an estimated recoverable value, and this is where I'm going to need your help very, very soon. So an impairment of assets. So at the end of each reporting period, the entity shall assess whether there is any indication that an asset may be impaired. If any such indication exists, the entity shall estimate the recoverable amount of the asset. Quick show of hands. How many of you have an active Facebook account? Oh, so we've got one that doesn't. Okay, so keep your hands up. There's a second part of this question. Okay, how many of you with an active Facebook account have an active MySpace account? Oh, so we actually have people in the room that know what MySpace is, which is better than what happened this morning. So what is MySpace for those that anyone want to share?
I just have it.
You just have it, you don't use it? Do you actually still use it?
No, but it's
It was what was before Facebook. I actually went and had a look at my account is still active. I went and had a look at it last night. I don't know what I was thinking with the picture that I chose to put up against it, but you do silly things. God, that was nearly 10 years ago. So MySpace was kind of a big deal back then. The backstory of this is, I just want to show you. So this is monthly, and this caps out at May 2011. I think it's actually got worse than that. But they started roughly the same point in time. It was about 2003. MySpace kind of went well. It was doing a lot better than Facebook for a while, and I'm sure Facebook could have kept going. And this is just for the US visitors. And it sort of capped out and dropped down. Facebook's just kept going. The very fact that no one in this room has basically heard of it would tend to suggest it's not done all that well. The backstory to MySpace is it was actually purchased in 2005 by Rupert Murdoch, or News Corp, and they paid $580 million for it. In 2009, they completely wrote the thing off. They just went, oh, that's not working. So they completely wrote off that acquisition. Now, I'm pretty sure on that $580 million, they're not getting a lot of physical, like when you're talking fair value of net identifiable assets, I don't think much of that 580 would actually be fair value of net identifiable assets. A lot of that's going to be goodwill. Everything got written off. Now, 2011, MySpace was sold by News Corp to a syndicate which included Justin Timberlake for $35 million. So they purchased it for 580, they sold it off for 35. Good deal. This would be a good indication that there's an impairment going on. The fact that you've flatlined and started to bottom out would start to suggest something is not right with the business. That's not necessarily where you're driving your revenues from, but because generally the visitors, actually, who has paid for anything? Like not sort of paid for a service, but who's actually paid Facebook any sort of money? I know from our running a page, like I know from the analytics, not a lot of people use it now. Facebook is actively dialing down using the algorithm, actually actively dialing down the number of people that see your posts with a page because instead what they're doing is giving you the option to pay to promote your posts. So I keep getting emails saying, you know, your post, like the ASR post, has been seen by X number of people. Would you like to promote it for $5 or for $10 or for $20? I'm like, of course I don't. You know, as much as I think it's a useful tool, I'm not paying money to promote what's on the ASR page to the wider community. It's there. If you want to use it, you want to use it. If you don't, you don't. I have never paid Facebook for anything. That said, they're using my information to target ads to me and all the rest of it, so they are getting advertising revenue from it. But that would be an indication of impairment. Something is going wrong. While we're on the social media trend and just talking about purchases and whatever of companies, any of you guys heard of Bebo? Did you hear how much he bought it? Because the guy that sold it, like the creator sold it for something like $800 million. And he bought it back last year. Did anyone hear how much? He bought it back for, I think it was to the tune of $1 million. They sold it, whoever he sold it to basically destroyed, like just ruined it. And he went, yeah, I'll just take it back. But Facebook's gone on a spending spree. Bought Instagram for $1 billion. So this 580 for MySpace seems like small bit. $1 billion for Instagram. They made a $3 billion offer for Snapchat. And they turned it down. Rocks in the head. That said, I don't really get Snapchat. It might be showing my age. I don't understand it, but there we go. But earlier this year, Facebook spent $19 billion buying WhatsApp. So if you talk about a $580 million purchase, like you're talking serious money that's being spent on these particular things. Anyway, so there's a lot of goodwill floating around. So once you've figured all that out, the recoverable amount is the higher of its fair value less cost to sell and value in use. So you're trying to figure out that number. And the whole point of that number is, if you've got this particular asset, what can you get from using it? That's your value in use. That is going to be a discounted cash flow type thing. So it's like basically what income stream do you get from this asset? That's your value in use. You then look at what could you get for selling this asset. That's your fair value less cost to sell. If this is 50 million and this is 70 million, the rational thing to do would be to sell the asset. So you pick that, the 70 million, as your recoverable amount. You then take that number and you compare it to the carrying value, and that figures out whether there's impairment. So if that 70 million is the recoverable amount and your asset is currently listed at 20, there is no impairment because your asset's under that recoverable amount. But if your asset's listed at 100 and this is at 70, you've got a problem because the next best thing the best thing you could do with this is at 70 million. So you've got to bring it down. And that's where you get the impairment. If there are indications that the conditions leading to the original impairment have decreased, you basically estimate the recoverable amount, and you can throw that back up as a reversal of the impairment as long as you don't exceed the carrying value that would have been determined had no impairment loss been recognized previously. And this is, I suppose, an important note coming into the exam. If we have anything to do with impairments, and from a practical point of view, you can absolutely guarantee we're going to have a ceiling situation. This is going to be in play if we go down an impairment route, because it's going to pick up this idea of a ceiling, and it's going to pick up those who weren't here or weren't paying attention, or whatever it happens to be. So just be aware of that and know how it works. Goodwill. Goodwill, you do not reverse. So for whatever reason, if News Corp still had it and MySpace started improving, you bring it, MySpace's goodwill gets impaired down, doesn't come up at all. Once it's gone, that bit's gone, it keeps going down until it's gone, then it's done. And the idea behind that is you basically bought that business and ruined it. Okay, that may be too strong language, but let's just say you bought that business, you've ruined it, and then you started to make it better. That's the business, not the original business getting better. You've kind of redone something to make it improve. So that's that idea. So it's kind of like an internally generated goodwill that's going on. And that's it. So we covered what information assets contain, the fact that management do play around with them, and just some of the accounting issues in relation to intangible assets.